One of the honestly most confusing takes I see all the time is that politics in Star Wars used to be this different, universal thing, where there were broad principles rather than any, quote, in-your-face contemporary references to events, issues, or people. George Lucas is many things, but subtle is not one of those, and outspoken about his beliefs very much is. So we're going to be looking through the prequels, starting today with The Phantom Menace, at some of the biggest references to those issues, peoples, and events which were very obvious at the time, though which may be less obvious in retrospect, particularly to people who were younger and less aware of what George and others involved in making the trilogy may have been getting at. Because the point is to keep this as on the nose as possible, the focus is going to be on very clear either in-text references or to things which George himself pointed out as being references or allegory in interviews or in directions he gave when making the movie. The Phantom Menace was written in the mid to late 1990s, leading up to its 1990 release, so while it lacked the context of 9/11, the War on Terror, and the Bush administration which so heavily informed the next two prequels, there was still plenty for George to manage to squeeze in. Probably the most prominent examples can be seen just by looking at character names like that of Viceroy Newt Gunray of the Trade Federation and Trade Federation Senator Lot Dodd. In the case of the former, Lucas had combined two of the most prominent Republican politicians of the time to come up with this name. Newt was a very obvious reference to Newt Gingrich, who became Speaker of the House in 1995 after the Republicans won both the House and the Senate in the midterm elections of 1994, elections which took place within a week of when George Lucas was starting to write The Phantom Menace, which we'll get back to in a moment. The Gunray part, while helpfully keeping the Newt G initials, is pretty much just swapping the syllables in President Ronald Reagan's last name, from Reagan to Gunray. There's a story that's pretty commonly presented as George Lucas suing Ronald Reagan for using the name Star Wars with his Strategic Defense Initiative in the 80s, but that isn't quite correct considering Reagan wasn't the one who used the label, and he had mixed feelings about it being used himself, though Lucas did strongly object to Star Wars being associated with the SDI in any way, and he sued basically anyone on either side of the issue who used the name. I've done a separate video on that already though. But in effect, what Lucas had done was like if a current Star Wars villain were named Kevin Umptrue or Nancy Idenbama or something, or if they got really weird and named it like and subscribe for more videos from Corey's datapad for some reason. Lot Dodd is probably the less prominent of these two examples, especially as we get farther away from the 90s. Newt Gingrich and Ronald Reagan remain pretty widely known people, but Trent Lott, one of Lot Dodd's two namesakes, isn't someone who comes up much anymore. Trent Lott first entered Congress as a Republican in the 1972 elections, riding the massive wave of Republican victories in Richard Nixon's re-election, who George has repeatedly mentioned as being the inspiration for Palpatine, saying in 1981, quote, Anakin Skywalker began hanging out with the Emperor, who at that point nobody knew was that bad because he was an elected official. He was a politician, Richard M. Nixon was his name. He subverted the Senate and finally took over and was really evil, end quote. Those inspirations are very subtle. Those inspirations remain, though they get much more centered around the Bush administration, particularly Dick Cheney, as the prequels go on. But for Trent Lott, he became far more relevant in the same 1994 midterm elections, which brought Gingrich into the House Speaker position. Gingrich became the Speaker of the House, and Lott became the Senate Majority Whip, which is basically a position responsible for making sure the votes within a party go a specific way on specific topics. And then in 96, he became the leader of the Senate Republican Conference, basically meaning he was the 90s Mitch McConnell. A big part of the Republican platform leading up to their victory was called the Contract with America, authored by Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey, a member of the House of Representatives who became House Majority Leader after the election, based on ideas from organizations like the Heritage Foundation, and much of the debate around this was centered on things like shrinking the federal government and deregulation, which are at least the things that are most relevant for what George was talking about in The Phantom Menace. George had this to say to Paul Duncan for the book The Star Wars Archives, quote, The film starts with corrupt corporations doing things behind people's backs. A corporation is a shark without a conscience. All it cares about is eating. It's not responsible, it's the stakeholders' fault, or the CEO's fault, or the board's fault. It's always somebody else's fault. But of course the golden rule is to make money no matter what, end quote. The Trade Federation is the entity representing this in the movie, and the names, not coincidentally, are sourced by George from some of the most prominent Republican politicians of the time. But this isn't an entirely partisan commentary. We've talked about the Lot in Lot Dodd, but the Dodd most likely comes from the name of Senator Chris Dodd, who in 1995 also became the chair of the Democratic National Committee. Lucas repeatedly commented on his opposition to capitalism and corporate interests ruling politics, so while he primarily held Republicans responsible, at least on a basic read of what he's doing in these movies, He was also expressing frustration at Democrats for varying degrees of either ineffectuality or complicity in these problems. He also loops this into the themes he says he's setting up with the symbiont circle of life and midichlorians, the Gungans and the Naboo, and all of the other pairs in the movie which represent how everything is interconnected, saying, quote, "The senators are more interested in themselves than in helping each other. They've fallen out of the symbiotic circle. They couldn't agree on anything because their interests became too divergent, so they couldn't get anything done as a republic, and the Chancellor uses this division, which he helped create, to become the Emperor." So again, while most of his ire was clearly directed towards one party, it wasn't something that he was clearing the other party of responsibility for either. The strategy of naming characters like this after real events, people, or corporations does come up again in the future, though in an area where George's involvement in the choice is a bit less clear, although clearly it was still something aligning with his views, when the Kaminoan senator named Halle Bertoni was pushing for her planet's economic interests over the well-being of the galaxy, a reference to the fracking of the Halliburton Corporation. George had his own thoughts on environmentalism and how he was reflecting it in his movies that we'll get to a bit later on though too. Another area where the characters were set up with a real-world political reference in mind didn't make it into the character's name, because I guess even George Lucas had limits on how on the nose you can be, but they did make it into his guidance for the actors, and it might have been something that he thought of more over time as he made the movie. Chancellor Valorum, the outgoing chancellor who's brought down by the vote of no confidence, was played by Terence Stamp, who recalled George summarizing Valorum's character to him by saying, quote, "He's a good man but beleaguered, a bit like President Clinton when asked for direction." Notably though, this beleaguerment did not refer to Clinton's own impeachment, as that did not happen until significantly after the filming was over for The Phantom Menace. These obvious political themes went beyond oblique or overt references to individuals and into the realm of issues that weren't just corporate greed or political corruption. You could point to the issues of inequality and slavery on Tatooine and the limits of the Republic's ability or willingness to do anything, but that's probably a few steps below how overt we're trying to stay with this, since I want to focus on areas where George Lucas himself set an explicit parallel between either one character and a real-life individual, or one issue in the movie and a real-life specific issue. There's a broader sense in which he says the movie is influenced by the interconnectivity we talked about already with the symbiont circle, with George also saying, quote, "We're getting a lot of greedy people and isolationists and nativists and xenophobes who say, 'I don't want to be with those people. That stuff has to fall away,'" end quote. But he also gets into an even more specific example than that in his conversation with Paul Duncan for the archives, global warming and environmentalism, which we brought up with Halle Bertoni earlier. Part of what he's representing with Naboo and the Gungans is a need for humans to see themselves as part of the ecosystem, something Obi-Wan calls out explicitly in the film.
"What happens to one of you will affect the other. You must understand this."
Lucas claims that while global warming may not destroy the planet per se, it would destroy humankind, and humans have to either adapt or migrate, with Duncan supplying that, quote, "The Gungans and Naboo have to make this decision about how to survive and save their planet. The only way to save the planet is by them joining together and cooperating." So on the one hand, it's true, when George is setting up these political ideas, there's a certain universality he's addressing or trying to address with the overall concepts. But the idea that these concepts were in any way divorced from specific examples in contemporary politics is simply untrue, and George Lucas would probably not be happy with the suggestion that he tried to keep those out. That's also why you can see some of these ideas shifting over time, like with the transition from Palpatine as a Nixon surrogate to his actions being meant by George to reflect the more immediate feelings Lucas had about President Bush and Vice President Cheney in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. I think you can maybe even see an example of this shift in how George even talks about the Phantom Menace. By the time the Star Wars archives for Episode 1, 2, and 3 were out in 2020, global warming had become the most visible environmentally related issue. But in the 80s and mid to late 90s, then the ozone layer would have been another very important topic and something that often got wrapped in with global warming. So even depending on when George is giving these interviews, his answers on what exactly he was talking about might shift a bit with the context of issues that he cares about. Although Trent Lott's name was never not Trent Lott. The farther you get from the time something was made, the more of these very relevant contemporary references may fall into obscurity, but these are very much the kinds of things that would have been known and relevant at the time that these movies were created. Any piece of media is always going to have some of the hallmarks of the time it was created, whether they think they're being overtly political or not. But in George's case, these were very intentional references, and they were set up for a reason. While the Star Wars prequels still kept the wars part of their name, The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones brought the political maneuvering much more to the forefront. In some cases, especially in The Phantom Menace and Revenge of the Sith, the references to contemporary political issues were even more on the nose, as I talked about in the Phantom Menace political breakdown, and will talk about in the Revenge of the Sith version. In Attack of the Clones, there weren't quite as many on-the-nose references, but mostly just because they'd been cut. The core message, though, remained very much the same, and it remained just as influenced by contemporary economic and political issues as every other Star Wars movie before it, at least the issues as George saw them. According to George in the Star Wars archives, when it comes to Attack of the Clones, quote, "The major story that is being told is actually two stories that are running in parallel to each other on the grander picture. They are, how does good become evil, and how does a democracy become a dictatorship, which is the social version of how does good become evil." When thinking about the political landscape of the United States in 2002, when Attack of the Clones came out, the big topics that come to mind would be the 2000 presidential election, 9/11, and the war in Afghanistan. The invasion of Iraq wouldn't happen until the following year. But despite how all-encompassing those topics would become in American political culture, the writing and principal photography for the movie took place between March and September of 2000, so the influence of those events would largely not be seen until Revenge of the Sith. George, still writing after the nominations had happened but before the actual presidential election took place, was very focused on how democratic institutions degrade, and how political idealism or naivete can give way to darker inclinations. He's trying to show how these institutions were ultimately given away, as he highlights with the line about liberty dying with thunderous applause in Revenge of the Sith, and as he again notes in the Star Wars archives when discussing how he couldn't as effectively show this background when making the original trilogy. He was, quote, loath to have Obi-Wan and Luke sit back and say, back in the days of the Republic, what happened to the Republic? Well, it was given away by the people, end quote. I thought about doing some impressions there, it would have been very bad, so we'll just leave it there. While Attack of the Clones still didn't get to the endgame, the function of how the Republic is given away are very much at the center of the plot, and a big focus is the role of money in politics. Obi-Wan and Anakin's early conversations about Padme have Obi-Wan doubting the sincerity of even Padme, saying that, quote, "Senators focus only on pleasing those who fund their campaigns, and they're in no means scared of forgetting the niceties of democracy to get those funds," a sentiment he essentially extends to Palpatine as well when Anakin objects. The background of the movie and the plot to assassinate Padme is based on the Senate vote for the Military Creation Act, something Padme is opposed to despite Jar Jar effectively moving to give Palpatine the power to create it in her absence. Some of the cut dialogue from the movies is a bit more on the nose about what George believes will go on or is going on in the Republic. Essentially that when they give in to creating the military, it'll show that the only path forward for either side is war. And on both the Republic and CIS sides, we're very explicitly shown that the people actually providing the means for the impending Clone Wars are interested only in money, not in any actual cause or any worries about corruption. They are, instead, the corruption themselves. Many of them didn't even bother to like and subscribe for more Star Wars videos. Dooku is mentioned at the start as being a political idealist, but we see the hypocrisy inherent in what he's doing in the movie. In his limited scenes, the way he's moving the CIS forward isn't an appeal to any of the ideals or the corruption he claims to see in the Republic. It's about the business interests of what Bale collectively calls the Commerce Guilds in preparing for war. Once again, the cut elements of the script put an even stronger point on this, with Dooku's presentation to the Separatist leaders including a passage which was ultimately included in the novelization as well. Quote, "Let me remind you of our absolute commitment to capitalism, of the lower taxes, the reduced tariffs, and the eventual abolition of all trading barriers. Signing this treaty will bring you profits beyond your wildest imagination. What we are proposing is complete free trade." You can kind of understand why these would be the first things on the cutting room floor when the movie's runtime was getting exceedingly long, since they make some pretty blunt points even more on the nose, but the useful side of that is how much they highlight to an even greater degree what George was going for here. Padme calls out what's going on even more directly to Dooku in a similarly cut scene, where Dooku tries to appeal to Padme by talking about the cult of greed in the Republic, one his prior quote shows isn't so much a problem for him, and this is something Padme is more than willing to point out, saying, "This is not government being bought out by business, it's business becoming government." And George will go on to say why he thinks this is such a bad thing. I'm sure some of the response to this would be that it doesn't count because this dialogue didn't make the final cut of the movie, but to that I would say again that the reason these lines were safe to cut is because they basically just put a more direct label on what remained in the text. They're kind of just George doing our analysis for us. None of these scenes were removed because George Lucas changed what he was fundamentally trying to say. The movie didn't turn into Anakin Shrugged at some point. And I think these are still especially applicable when we are talking about the political context and the motivations behind the movie, especially since so many made it into final drafts of the script or even rough cuts of the film. Because the point is how these democratic institutions are given away from within, this motivation extends to the Republic as well. The Kaminoans are just as into the war profiteering as the Trade Federation, and so are the other politicians within the Republic. When Obi-Wan is trying to find out who the Kaminoans were, he goes to Dex, who tells him what determines the Kaminoans' friendliness is
on how good your manners are, how big your pocketbook is.
So the creation of the clone army on the Kaminoan side isn't for any kind of ideologically pure reason either. We know the whole situation is a maneuver for more power from Palpatine, a factor we'll get more of in a minute. And George is telling us in the text that what motivates what the Trade Federation is doing and what motivates the Kaminoans is just the money of providing this war machine. The Trade Federation may have the additional political goal of overthrowing the Republic once they're on board with Dooku to allow themselves to operate free of any regulation or taxes, but the game that Kamino is playing isn't that fundamentally different. If people are happy to pay, they're happy to build an army, essentially representing the massive military spending, not just on the actual forces used for war, but on all the logistics around that and the other industries that arise around that. Several years later in the Clone Wars cartoon, this was yet again pointed out with the Kaminoan senator being named Halle Bertoni, a very clear reference to Halliburton, a company which was involved in the American military activities throughout the 90s, starting with Operation Desert Storm, during which Dick Cheney was the defense secretary. Afterwards, Halliburton was involved in research on using private military contractors, and then, conveniently in 1995, Dick Cheney became the CEO of Halliburton. This led to even further controversy when he became vice president under George W. Bush, when contracts relating to the next invasion of Iraq were awarded to Halliburton. Whatever the actual legality of that is the system that George Lucas is criticizing, and several of these things would have been going on in Lucas's awareness. Remember, from Padme's quote, what Lucas is saying is happening is that the businesses are becoming the government. And according to him, quote, if you ascribe to the idea that most businesses are greedy, then it's very easy to see that they're more on the dark side than the side of light and compassion. In business, it's the stockholder comes first. He then goes on to say, are we going to end up with a bunch of little wars as trade breaks down? They all get greedy and they start a fight. And this still ties into the motivations of the politicians Lucas is criticizing. While Obi-Wan's quote may be wrong about Padme in the moment because she does hold to those ideals, money will still have a corrupting influence. The degradation of the system is the ultimate point, that power gets awarded to the dictator, in this case Palpatine, by that system in a way many people would celebrate. And that is what Attack of the Clones is setting up. Padme is supposed to be the kind of beacon of hope in the movie, but she does give in to Anakin's aggressive negotiations by the end of the movie as well, as Anne Lancashire of the University of Toronto points out in her article Attack of the Clones and the Politics of Star Wars. She, like Dooku, has moved beyond the well-meaning idealist into being someone contributing, however unwillingly, and there's some varying levels of willingness on either side of that, to the system she's allegedly trying to stop. A criticism of Padme which could also be leveled at any already exceedingly wealthy person selling their already large company to an even larger, more monopolistic entity. But at the core of all of Lucas's Star Wars work, at least until Episode 3, the shadow of one particular real-world figure is always lurking around the corner: Richard Nixon.
Nixon's back!
Well, in Episode 3, we'll see this fear of a dictatorship shifted a bit more to George Bush in the reaction to 9/11. It was President Nixon who made Lucas explore this line of thinking with his franchise to begin with. Quote, at one point, Nixon thought he might try to change the Constitution so he could run for a third term. That set me off thinking about how a presidency falls, and doing research on all kinds of democracies, from Greece to Rome. Going on to say, in Episode 2, Darth Sidious creates a war. It's not real. We've got to defend ourselves against the droids and the separatists. It just so happens that the Kaminoans are building droids, so we should buy the clones. And everybody cheers. This is how freedom dies, with cheers. The personal stories of the characters often take a back seat to these ideas in Attack of the Clones, and as the first quote from George about the dual story on good becoming evil alludes to, they also reinforce those themes. Anakin's naivete when it comes to the Chancellor and his half-joking defense of dictatorship exists alongside Padmé's idealism and belief in democracy, always pointing to what ultimately happens to the Republic will be that people give it away on the idea Anakin expresses. If a dictatorship makes people finally agree and take action, why not try it? And it's that pretense that allows Palpatine to keep gathering power. That third Nixon term hangs heavily over the movie, as Padmé mentioned that she had been offered a constitutional amendment to remove term limits, allowing her to continue to serve as queen, since she was so popular as Queen of Naboo. But unlike Palpatine, still a stand-in for Nixon, Padmé refuses. And this is, again, notably the result of people clamoring for her to stay in, not her own desire. And it's only her convictions which prevent her from accepting that position. Palpatine's acceptance of extra power is again played off the same way. He's reluctantly accepting what's being forced upon him, keenly aware that if his allies grant him that power, people would be suspicious. But if Amidala does it, theoretically the leader of the opposition, which is a whole other thing to unpack, considering their seemingly also close relationship, let alone that they're both the senators from Naboo, but then it'd be fine if she brings it up. Everything is being manufactured so it can seem like Palpatine is reluctantly accepting these powers. In the script, all he's asking for is that he be allowed to retire quietly once the crisis is over. The Republic gets its clone armies with mechanized mounts, bringing them closer to the organic versus mechanical aesthetic divide we see at Hoth and Endor for the good guys versus the bad guys, something we also saw in Episode 1 with the Gungans and the droids. And we're well on the way to the transition from the Republic to Empire we'll see culminate in our next topic, Revenge of the Sith. Star Wars movies have always had a modern political context behind them, informing the choices made in their development, and in some cases taking the shape of overt references to issues of the day, albeit reskinned into a galaxy far, far away. I've already covered how this informed the development of, and expressed itself in, The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, and today we're going to look at how that worked in the final movie of the prequels, Revenge of the Sith. While Attack of the Clones came out after the American election of 2000, 9/11, and the beginnings of the War on Terror, it had been written before any of those events, meaning their impact was less felt in Attack of the Clones, but with Revenge of the Sith, all of these things would factor into the movie's development. The 2003 invasion of Iraq preceded the principal photography of Revenge of the Sith, which occurred between June and September of 2003, but it was after the script was written. But while all of those things will play into what we're talking about today, it's also important to remember how foundational George Lucas's view of the Vietnam War, Watergate, and American President Richard Nixon were to how he viewed these contemporary events. In a lot of ways, the prequels as a whole were basically a commentary on those contemporary events, so in the case of Revenge of the Sith, 9/11, the War on Terror, and the Bush administration, but essentially interpreted through Lucas's feelings about Vietnam, Watergate, and Nixon. Fundamentally, Star Wars in the prequel trilogy reflects George's idea that democracies will be given away by the people living within it. Specifically, so far, in the prequels, he'd been showing them as corrupted by corporate interests. But basically, the idea is that throughout history, there has been, is, and will be a cycle of figures like Palpatine trying to take advantage of various situations to turn democracy into a dictatorship. And this is done not despite, but at the urging of the people who live within that democracy. The extra powers taken by Palpatine in the movie are intended to mirror things like George's repeated claims that Richard Nixon wanted to amend the Constitution to allow himself to stay in power, which in the modern context, or at least modern at the time of Revenge of the Sith, became a comparison for things like the Patriot Act, which included expansion of surveillance powers by the government and other restrictions of liberties in the wake of 9/11. One thing to remember is that whether you agree with Lucas's conclusions or premises on any of these issues, when we're dealing with how political issues impacted the movies, it's important to start from the position of how Lucas himself saw them. For example, despite how important Lucas mentions the third Nixon term as being in a lot of the ideas that informed the prequels, The question of repealing the 22nd Amendment, which limits presidents to 2 terms, was not unique to Nixon. These term limits were still relatively new, and as Peabody and Grant discuss in their article The Twice and Future President, direct criticism of the 22nd Amendment from presidents themselves came more heavily from Truman and Eisenhower right after it was enacted. Pushing for its repeal under Nixon primarily came from other supporter groups very briefly in his second term before Watergate made that a complete non-starter. But for Lucas, his opposition to Nixon and the Vietnam War more generally informs how he looked at other political issues going forward. Because again, George himself repeatedly talks about this as a historical cycle, so Nixon wasn't this aberration, it basically becomes a mental framework that he's using to judge the events going on around the prequels as well. One of the 2 major lines in the movie which people gravitate towards when discussing its politics is when Anakin says,
"If you're not with me, then you're my enemy."
This is something which is very much in the political discourse of the United States at the time in the wake of 9/11, and it's something that very closely mirrors quotes given by American political leaders. Hillary Clinton, who was then a Democratic New York senator, said some variation of nations either being with the states or with the terrorists shortly after 9/11, which was followed up quickly by President George W. Bush saying, quote, "Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists," end quote. But even though this had started as a basically bipartisan idea, complaints about the film tended to come from conservatives who saw Anakin's line as an attack on Bush's leadership, especially as the film had come out several years after a lot of this early support from Democrats for a lot of the actions taken by the Bush administration had significantly waned. But we'll get back to some of that bipartisan support and how it impacted Revenge of the Sith soon. Rick McCallum, producer throughout the prequels, called conservative complaints that the prequels criticized Bush such shit, I promise you. I know there's one line, you're either with me or you're against me, that echoes something, but that was actually in the script way before it had even become a nightmare that it was possible that Bush could become president. That line has been echoed since the beginning of time. He says instead that Lucas's concern was with Nixon in Vietnam. But I think this goes back to positioning Nixon as a unique evil in Lucas's eyes and ignores Nixon being more emblematic of the cycle of democracies being handed away, which Lucas definitely saw as a connection with Bush and the War on Terror, even if Nixon was what prompted his original interest in it and had made him think about using it as a storyline in the prequels to begin with. When presenting Revenge of the Sith at the Cannes Film Festival, George himself said, quote, "The parallels between what we did in Vietnam and what we're doing in Iraq now are unbelievable," end quote. So while yes, Vietnam and Nixon remained the prime movers of George's political constellation, those parallels being something George was commenting on was probably not in fact such shit, and instead fed into George's belief in the cycle that leads to democracy being given away. And this is certainly something which audiences noted as having strong parallels to the political rhetoric which existed around them all the time. This extended to the rhetoric about security in the movie, which was originally a bit more on the nose than it was in the final draft, like a lot of what we talked about in Attack of the Clones. An earlier draft of the scene where Palpatine appoints Anakin to the Council involved a discussion between the two on the need to endure constitutional amendments in the name of security, again mirroring discussions around the increasing security apparatus at the time, a specific theme which was a lot more present in Revenge of the Sith than in Attack of the Clones or The Phantom Menace, again indicating how the discourse in wider society might have influenced what George was exposed to and how these themes were expressed in the movie. It's not that this was a complete non-factor before, this is something that came up a bit with Padme security in Episode 2, but I think it's hard to look at Revenge of the Sith, whether the final product or the earlier drafts, and not see these specific expressions being influenced by how they were discussed in the wider political context. The way terrorism and national security were discussed, especially in the United States, but also internationally, were very different after 9/11 than before. And I think the way Padme's security in Episode 2 is talked about versus the way the Republic's security in Episode 3 reflects that difference. The second line is, of course, Padme's,
"So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause."
Which again highlights the through line George always says he's pointing to with Star Wars and that we keep going back to in these videos. Democracy is gladly given away by the people refusing to like this video and subscribe for more. I think looking at how the focus of each prequel shifts in how it displays this to mirror issues as they developed in the world when the movies were written helps underline the impacts those things had on the movie's production, and how George saw each issue fitting into this cycle. The flavor of how Palpatine was gaining power in Episode 1 emphasized problems with deregulation and the fecklessness of a beleaguered president beset by scandal, which matched his views of Bill Clinton and the aims of the Republicans in the '94 midterms. The focus on business and corporate exploitation maintained more through Attack of the Clones, especially in the cutscenes, and then with Revenge of the Sith, a greater emphasis was placed on the state security apparatus, while critiques of the corporate lobbying fell by the wayside. Even the final cut of Attack of the Clones, which was made after the events of 9/11 and the start of the War on Terror, tended to de-emphasize a lot of the scenes, really explaining what the CIS was going for with all the corporate exploitation, like the one with Dooku and Amidala. Instead, keeping just the focus on the security elements, which would get even more focus in Revenge of the Sith. It kind of represents a shift in who Lucas was focusing on as being responsible for giving away democracy. As noted with the "with us or against us" quotes, the sentiments in favor of the war and emergency powers came not just from Bush and the Republicans, but also from Democrats like Clinton, especially early on. Support was both widespread and bipartisan. The Patriot Act, despite becoming controversial after the fact, was passed a month after the September 11th attacks, with 83% of the House of Representatives voting for it, including almost every Republican and 69% of Democrats, and in the Senate, 98 senators voted for it out of a total of 100. The 2001 Authorization of Military Force Joint Resolution, which gave the President authority to act without congressional approval against any group suspected to have been involved in the planning or execution of September 11th, was passed in the House with 420 votes for and only 1 against, and made it through the Senate with 98 votes for and none against, despite misgivings even at the time about how broadly these powers could be applied. This is what was used for the invasion of Afghanistan, although not Iraq, which was a separate vote in 2002 before the 2003 invasion. For those who oppose the wars, this level of bipartisan support in the government for the Patriot Act, as well as the Afghanistan and then Iraq war, which was less supported by elected Democrats, but still pretty heavily supported, was very much an example of what Padme was talking about with Liberty dying to thunderous applause. There's another set of cutscenes focusing on Padme and the delegation of 2000, a group of senators who are opposed to the war and want to stop the power that Palpatine is gathering around him. The emphasis in these scenes is very much on these senators being loyal to the Republic, not loyal to the Separatists, in the same way that people who dissented against the War on Terror or the earlier Vietnam War were often labeled as terrorist sympathizers or communists. The symbolism of a post-9/11 America has some other expressions in the movie as well. Scott Mendelson in Forbes makes note of the, quote, imagery during the film's carnage-filled final half, most notably a Jedi temple burning to the ground as meant to evoke 9/11, end quote. The intentionality of having shots of the Jedi Temple evoke 9/11 has long been discussed on fan forums, with some claiming Lucasfilm reps confirmed this was the intent, but I've never been able to find that. Again though, I think this is somewhere where, regardless of whether it was a directly intentional move, it's certainly a parallel which fed into the discussion around the movie's political context at the time. Lucas, to a smaller degree, and Rick McCallum, to a larger degree, often tried to downplay the idea of contemporary references in the prequels, instead talking about how they turned out to be eerily prescient, saying in the Chicago Tribune in 2005, quote, "First of all, we never thought of Bush ever becoming president, or then 9/11, the Patriot Act, war, weapons of mass destruction. Then suddenly you realize, oh my god, there's something happening that looks like we're almost prescient. And then we thought, well yeah, but he'll never make it to a second term, so we'll look like we made some wacky political parody of a guy that everyone's forgotten," end quote. But again, while McCallum keeps referring to these movies as being written before even Bush's election, that doesn't seem to match the production timelines we do know of, especially knowing how many revisions the scripts got even shortly before principal photography, which was much later. It's hard to take the claim seriously that there was absolutely no impact of modern politics, and that it was solely about an abstract cycle, or still just a reaction to Vietnam, when the focus of the film shifts to match important political issues going on during the conventionally known writing and production windows for the movies. This is why I think it makes sense to reconcile that by looking at the prequels in the context of Lucas's statements about all of this being one more expression in a historical cycle, which to Lucas always comes through the lens of Nixon and Vietnam. It's hard to give credit for talking about being surprisingly prescient when in every single case, they're talking about predicting events which happened shortly before or during the writing of the proper movie scripts and production of the movie rather than after. There was certainly already the premise of Palpatine gaining power by being voluntarily given it for sure, but going through the specifics in each movie up to and including Revenge of the Sith, I think it's hard to ignore the contemporary skin on the way those issues played out and the way that impacted where the focus was in each movie. That's going to do it for our look at the political context of Revenge of the Sith. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this series, which I'm sure I'll continue with other bits of Star Wars media in the future. I think another interesting one would be some of the books released around Revenge of the Sith, like Labyrinth of Evil and even the Revenge of the Sith novelization, which played a lot more openly into Iraq War parallels. Special thanks to the patrons showing up on screen now, as well as the channel members whose support makes the channel possible. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to get alerts for future videos, and I hope to see you next time.